everyone, and welcome to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and along with my co-host, Chris Kaye, we discuss and dissect our favorite music, heavy metal. So sit back, relax, pop open a cold one, and let the debate begin. All right, welcome back. This is Debating Metal. I'm Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and I'm here with my co-host, Chris Kaye. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing pretty good.
This is episode 3. We're back for another week's worth of debating, if you want to call it that. I think we're going to debate more today than we have the first 2 episodes.
Absolutely.
And our subject today is a somber one. Chris, why don't you tell them what we're going to talk about today?
We're going to be talking about the deaths of musicians and how it affected the sound of a band. To make it more specific, we're trying to keep it in the realm of bands that continued after the death of that musician and how that person impacted the band.
So how the death impacted them and how the change in personnel affected them.
Yeah, just aspects like how that person contributed to the band via songwriting, the sound, etc. That changed the upcoming albums, really.
Okay. Sounds good. What else are we going to talk about today?
We have to mention that 3 drummers have died this year, starting with Neil Peart. We've got 2 others.
Yeah, we have Neil Peart died. He was to put it in a weird way, he was the first one to die. Then we had Sean Reinhart from Cynic and Death.
Appeared on one album for Death, but was mainly Cynic, jazzy metal band, a death metal band.
Yeah, a jazzy death metal band. Who would have thought?
But it worked.
It worked, yes. And then also Reed Mullen from Corrosion of Conformity, the original drummer, who had been replaced a few years ago because of alcohol problems. So all 3 of these drummers were influential in their fields, and obviously Neil was huge worldwide. Sean Reinhart was huge in his circles, and Reed was very influential early on in the mid to late 80s.
I don't know as much about Reed Mullen. Definitely will look into him. But as far as the other 2, I mean, we all know Neil Peart. Hugely influential to not just guys in metal, hard rock, but just any musicians. I mean, he's well liked. Not huge in the realm of doing interviews or anything like that.
Oh, he hated him.
He absolutely freaking hated him.
And he hated talking about drumming. That's the weird thing.
Yeah. But so many people list him as a influence.
Oh, he was beyond drummers. He was influential to all sorts of musicians.
Songwriting.
Songwriting.
He's the main songwriter for all albums of Rush past the first one.
So yeah, he wrote all their lyrics. I always think that's kind of weird, as with Geddy Lee being the singer. Mm-hmm. How is it that you didn't write lyrics?
Well, I mean, it's the same for Black Sabbath with Ozzy.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
he didn't really write lyrics. He contributed in other ways with the melodies of songs, etc., but didn't really have any major contribution to the lyrics.
Right. We were talking about that the other day with Dee Snider and how he was the main songwriter of Twisted Sister. Mm-hmm. Yet I'm sitting there thinking, how is it that a band can have 5 guys in the band, 2 of them being guitar players, and they not write music? That's a subject for another time, but it's something that we talked about the other day briefly, and it's just very strange. I almost call it an anomaly in music, because Dee he's a great singer, he's a great songwriter, but how is it that he didn't share or they just didn't want to, and it's just kind of weird. So, but yeah, so Neil's death is what pretty much inspired this episode and what we're going to talk about.
Kind of. I mean,
kind of.
There was a conversation which revolved around Randy Rhoads.
Yes,
and that's kind of where we started. But just the passing of somebody so major is always difficult, and definitely brought rise to this.
For sure. So why don't we go ahead and start talking about Randy? So let's talk about Ozzy first. I know that he was one of the ones that you wanted to mention, and so he is. His death was hugely, greatly impactful on what happened afterward.
Oh, for sure. With Ozzy, Randy Rhoads was in the band for a brief amount of time. In 1980 and 1981, they had really two very successful albums. Everybody knows Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman. A big part of what made those albums successful was his partnership with Randy Rhoads. That being Ozzy, his partnership with Randy Rhoads.
Right.
Working with him, they had a lot more freedom than he had when he was in Black Sabbath. You had huge personalities in Black Sabbath. You had Tony Iommi, who's known as the riff master. You had Geezer, who was just a master of his instrument himself. Bill Ward, and that was during the entire time that Ozzy was in the band with Bill Ward.
Right.
So all these guys were just masters of their craft, and Ozzy wanted a little more freedom musically. He wasn't happy during Technical Ecstasy, left the band briefly. And during the recording of Never Say Die, he decided he wanted to rejoin the band. And I say that during the recording, it was probably more right around the time it was about to start. They had recorded a live version of one of the songs off of Never Say Die with Dave Walker, who replaced him briefly. But none of that really came to fruition. They changed all the lyrics of the album. It didn't go well. They did a tour for Never Say Die, but everything was going awry. He was becoming more detached from the band.
Van Halen kicked their ass.
Absolutely, they did. That was a big thing. I mean, you had Van Halen on tour that was rocking the show every night, and Black Sabbath was just disappointing.
Yep.
And that was from a number of accounts.
I wish I would have seen that. I mean, I was 10 at the time, 79 or 8, 9, 10 at the time. So I wouldn't have been able to see that. I wouldn't have known the difference back then anyway. But
well, the big thing was that the band was huge into drugs and alcohol. I mean, they were well documented in that, in indulging, but they really all felt like Ozzy was going overboard. So that really says something.
Yeah, it does say something when you kick a guy out of a band because you're the worst.
You're the
alcoholic.
worst.
You're the worst drunk.
Yeah.
You're the worst drug addict.
So he was fired, and he was kind of left wondering what to do next. Randy Rhoads was previously in Quiet Riot, and that was kind of under the radar, but it was for the first two albums. At the time, they were pretty relatively unknown in the U.S., and while they had a bit of a following in the L.A. scene, they had two albums that had only been released in Japan. Nobody in the U.S. really knew who they were unless you were in that scene.
The LA scene being pretty tight, they all knew Randy, but no one really outside that circle knew who Randy was. And
well, luckily,
somebody
from Slaughter did. He would be in Slaughter later. That was Dana Strum. He convinced Randy Rhoads, after pestering him, to audition for Ozzy's band. Ozzy was just so impressed when he did try out that he gave him the job pretty much on the spot. He just listened to him tune up, and he played a couple riffs just to test his guitar out, and he was mind blown. And Randy didn't even realize it was the audition. I mean, he was just tuning up. So he was astonished. I mean, he was just blown away that he made it to the band. It went like butter from there. Most fans now know Blizzard of Oz and Diary quite well, with songs like Crazy Train, Over the Mountain, Goodbye to Romance, Mr. Crowley, Flying High Again. I mean, you can really name every song on the album, and they're pretty much a hit. There was a controversy, unfortunately, arose right after the recording of Diary of a Madman, and they kicked out Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake from the band. That was Sharon Osbourne, fired both of them. And even on the album cover, and if you looked on the insert, you had Rudy Sarzo and who replaced
Tommy Aldrich.
Tommy Aldrich. So you didn't have it was pretty bittersweet for Randy Rhoads.
Sharon tried to basically eliminate the fact that those two guys, Lee and Bob, were on the album, and that's and they
which came later.
No, but even then, I mean, considering that
she
they
didn't
said,
want their
that
names
they put
on there.
Rudy's face on there, they had a picture. picture with the four of them, Ozzy, Randy, Rudy, and Tommy.
Yeah.
They completely left off Lee Kerslake and Bob off the album.
And if you don't know, later on, there was even bigger controversy when she had their parts re-recorded so they wouldn't get credit on them.
Without Ozzy's knowledge, by the way.
Yes.
And as soon as he found out that went down, he
got it fixed.
He got it fixed. And good for him.
Yeah. So what ended up happening was Randy Rhoads was really upset by this and considered that was the first time he considered leaving the band. He didn't want to go on tour for the album. Everyone around him, including Bob Daisley, said, "Don't be stupid. You're the star of the show. Really. Just keep going on. Don't lose the job for us."
Yeah, and then that was also part of the chemistry that they had there. I mean, that first album, Blizzard of Oz. Well, both basically. I mean, they had grown so much when they made Diary, and I mean, Diary, as much as a masterpiece as Blizzard of Oz is. There's such an enormous jump in ability and technicality.
It was a cleaner album. I mean, the Blizzard was a little more raw, but Diary was, from that brief amount of time in 1 year, they had just become so tight.
Yeah.
So around this time, and it's been documented, that Randy went to Ozzy and said he was considering leaving the band so he could, get a degree in classical guitar. He wanted to kind of focus on that and leave rock music for a little while. Honestly, we don't know what would have happened. Right. Because unfortunately he died in a plane crash.
I mean, when you see so many of the interviews from when they talk about that, everyone kept saying, well, Randy was probably going to leave. Randy was going to leave.
But probably we only go so far.
Right. I mean, it could have been something where they took a break for 6 months or whatever, and he got his thing, and who knows what would have happened.
Oh, absolutely.
We never got to that point to understand what actually was going to happen.
So, I mean, we really don't know if that would have ever come to fruition. And in 1982, Randy Rhoads died in a plane crash at the age of 25.
Yeah, it's just terrible.
But it's really telling to say that this guy, who really only had 4 albums and 2 of them were well known, and the other 2 pretty much non-existent, had 2 amazing hit albums under his belt. And so many people revered him as their biggest idol, people that inspired them to play guitar, like Dimebag Darrell, John Petrucci, Zakk Wylde even, who later joined Ozzy's band, Alexi Laiho from Children of Bodom, Paul Gilbert, so beyond what we even know, I'm sure.
And probably to this day, too, and when people listen back. He's my favorite guitar player. Back in that, in those days when in the mid 80s, when I was growing up, even though he had passed away, Randy's influence was still felt. And there was always that fight in magazines, all the metal magazines. Is it Eddie or is it Randy? Is it Ace or is it Eddie? Is it Ace or is it Randy? I don't know why Ace was even in the conversation, because he's nowhere near as good as either one of those two.
No, I mean, as far as his playing skills, I mean, it's not the same, but as far as his presence on the stage,
different
factor.
I even me not knowing as much as I back then about stuff like that, I even knew Ace couldn't touch either one of them.
Oh, yeah.
But Eddie, the whole thing between Eddie and Randy, I chose my side, and not because I dislike Eddie at all, because it just Randy. There was just something beautiful about Randy's playing.
Oh yeah,
where there was something extremely. The speed and blistering effects that Eddie had. Randy had them too, but there was something just so technical about Randy that made it just beautiful and sweet to hear him play.
Yeah, and speaking of the Randy and Eddie aspect of that, Eddie really didn't have a lot of positive things to say about Randy Rhoads. I mean, not as a person, but as a player. He basically had the opinion that he was just doing all the same things that Eddie did, and as somebody that started and was a groundbreaker in that field, I get the apprehensiveness when you see somebody rising and getting the attention that was yours, but at the same time,
it was jealousy.
He had
straight up
jealousy. Yeah, he had to recognize that Randy Rhoads was incredible player.
There's no way you couldn't. I mean, you also think too that
he admitted that. Right, he said that
at the time too. George Lynch was around, and George Lynch is older and most of the guys that were from the LA scene at that time, younger than Eddie, but older than that whole scene, with Rat, Motley Crue, and all those guys. And he was also considered at one point for the Ozzy gig,
which I was about to get into, actually.
And so he was just as good, if not,
oh yeah,
equal in some cases. And so
fantastic guitars.
So when you think about all the guitar players that came out of LA at the time, I mean, Randy rises to the top, Eddie rises to the top. For the most part, George too, because I mean he's an incredible guitar player. But
he did, but I mean his skills are there,
right? I mean each of their paths went different ways, and obviously we know what happened with Randy.
So with Randy's untimely passing, really, where did this leave Ozzy's band? Well, initially
Ozzy was shattered.
He initially
Shattered.
he wanted to quit music. Understandably so.
Yeah, for sure.
He'd been through a lot, even though he wasn't very happy in Black Sabbath, it was difficult to be fired from, his long-term friendships with these guys.
Yeah. He was having a rough bunch of years.
Yeah, he was having a tough time, and the drug addiction obviously didn't help.
No, I mean, think about it. That's a 4-year span. That's not very long.
No.
I mean, between 78, I mean, obviously, everything that happened with Black Sabbath was building up throughout the 70s, but you're talking about 78 having a bad year, 79 with Technical Ecstasy.
Well, 78 was Technical Ecstasy.
Oh, I mean, with
79
with
was Never Say Die.
And then, you get fired from the band. You're basically blitzed out on your mind, drugs and alcohol, and you finally put enough together to get a band. You have this great band for 2 years, and all of a sudden it comes to a screeching halt.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you do?
Luckily, and, to her credit and to her detriment, Sharon was there and wouldn't let it happen. She told him, you got to keep going. You'll get past this. It's hard, but you'll keep going.
Oh, they had a tour to finish.
They had 7 more shows to play with. They had more than 7 more shows to play, but they had 7 shows that they played with Bernie Tormé, he played with Ian Gillan, who had actually later joined Black Sabbath. Right. But of Deep Purple fame.
6 degrees of separation of England.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's
English
it's so bizarre because all of this is going to cross over with every story. But he played with Ian Gillan. He had more of a jazzy style that didn't necessarily fit in with the rest of the band. They kind of quickly realized that he wasn't going to make it. But he was never really intending to join the band full time. So it was a mutual thing. That being said, Ozzy spoke very highly of him. Said that he did as well as anybody could have done in those 7 shows following Randy's death.
Right.
So he didn't last long. But then we had Brad Gillis of Night Ranger fame that joined the band. Unfortunately for Mr. Gillis, it didn't go well. Ozzy took all of his frustration out on him. He was dealing with Randy's death, who was a young guy, a friend. He just never accepted Brad Gillis into the band, and he abused him. I mean, he didn't stay there. His tenure only lasted long enough for them to record Speak of the Devil, the live album,
which was an incredibly good album.
It is very good, but it was not something Ozzy wanted to do either.
No, that was a last second replacement. They wanted to put out an album, which ended up being tribute, and title it "Speak of the Devil," and Ozzy said, "No, there's no way I'm going to let you do that. Not with Randy on it." Yeah. So
they did "Speak of the Devil," which was a cover of Black Sabbath songs. I mean, it was a live version of Black Sabbath songs. Dictated to him that he had to put this album out, and
recorded at the Ritz in New York City.
And it was a great album, but the cracks were already there. Brad wasn't going to stay. That kind of also prompted the exit of Rudy Sarzo, who had taken over bass at that point. What that did bring in was the return of Bob Daisley.
Oddly enough.
Yeah, oddly enough. Sour relationship, but, Bob was a little smarter about things, get writing credit. Unfortunately, something odd happened on this one, which I'll get to. It also brought in Jakey Lee, which was the first true replacement for Randy Rhoads. So, interestingly enough, Jakey Lee joined Dio just right before he joined Ozzy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was in the band very briefly.
Is that after Vivian Campbell?
No, it was at the very
before
beginning.
Vivian.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay. Because I was going to say 83, I think, is when...
It was a newly formed band right after him leaving
Okay.
Black Sabbath. So, again...
What's with everybody leaving Black Sabbath?
Things... well, 400 more people would leave Black Sabbath over the course of that. So.
Yeah, I know. The 80s.
But was there for a very, very brief amount of time. Their styles just didn't mesh. So.
He went in through the outdoor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was again Dana Strum who recommended Jakey Lee. So another connection there. So what makes Bark at the Moon a little easier to compare to the previous album? So you got Bob Daisley, you got Ozzy, so you've got one of the major songwriters from the previous album involved. You've got a new drummer for a studio album, Tommy Aldridge, and you got Jakey Lee. So the biggest contributing factor that you can keep them apples to apples is just that one major change to the band.
What's funny about Tommy doing that album is that he's not on the album cover. Carmine.
A piece.
I was going to say Appice, but that's Vinny.
That's Vinny.
No, yeah, Carmine ends up being, trying to partner up with Ozzy. Mm-hmm. And he's on the videos. I don't think he's on the album.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't play on the album. That was Tommy Aldridge on the album.
So Tommy basically doesn't play on any Ozzy album other than Speak of the Devil at that point. That's the only one because he wasn't on Diary.
No.
So I'm sorry. He plays on Bark at the Moon, but then he's not credited with being on the album.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of odd things going on there because actually Ozzy is the only one that has a writing credit on Bark at the Moon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jake got screwed on that one.
He did.
And didn't talk about it for the longest time.
He was actually under contract not to talk about it.
And I think he technically still is, but he finally just said, what the hell with this?
Enough of it, yeah. Really, a big factor, again, was Bob Daisley wrote a lot of the material with Jakey Lee. Ozzy would come in, contribute some minor amount, sometimes contributing to the sound of a song. So, I mean, he was involved for sure. There's no doubt about that, but...
He's not a songwriter.
He's really not. Okay, so how did the album stack up in comparison to Blizzard and Diary? While Blizzard was certified 6 times platinum, Diary was certified 3 times platinum. So,
and to me, Diary's better.
And to most aficionados and fans of the band specifically, like real true fans and not just casual listeners, that is the better album. But I think more people know Crazy Train, so the casual fan will pick up that album instead.
Yeah. I
mean, you can't go to any sports arena without hearing Crazy Train.
No, of course. I mean, to me, Randy recording Blizzard, again, like I said before, that was the stepping stone to get to Diary, where Diary was like the masterpiece. That was the final. To me, Randy's best song is "Diary of a Madman" for what he did for Ozzy, and that the whole instrumentation of that song is incredible.
"Diary of a Madman" was certified 3 times platinum, but Bark at the Moon was as well. So, on the cursory level, they're really not a whole lot different. So Jakey Lee did step in and fill a void pretty well.
He did. I mean, Jake is an amazing guitar player. I've seen him live in person when he had Badlands. I mean, he's just an incredible talent. He went in there under very difficult circumstances and puts together an album with Bob Daisley. I mean, Bark at the Moon's got some good songs. Journey to the Center of Eternity, So Tired, obviously Rock and Roll Rebel, obviously Bark at the Moon. Bark at the Moon is a huge hit. I mean, it's, to me, up until that point, it is Ozzy's second biggest hit. There's Crazy Train and then Bark at the Moon. Bark at the Moon put Ozzy back on the map.
For sure.
And that's what he needed at the time.
But what was different, though, was that Randy's situation was so much more open and free. He had the complete trust of Ozzy.
Right.
And Ozzy wasn't as broken at that point. So Jakey Lee comes in and he's in a more restrictive environment. He's in a more Sharon controlled environment.
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with the death of Randy. it was almost like trust. It's like, I lost the riff master. I'm not friends with him anymore. I have Randy, who's now had become my best friend, and he's gone. I had this, issues with Bernie and Brad, self-inflicted. And then here comes Jake doing anything and everything he can to please Ozzy, so much so that he gave up his writing credit because Sharon comes over and says, you know what, you got to sign this contract or you're never going to make it.
Or we'll find somebody else.
Yeah, we'll find someone else and you'll be gone and you'll be history and no one will ever know who Jakey Lee is. So he does it, and he does it under those circumstances and put out a great performance. Plus, it was the 80s, 1983, and we're talking about time, not just times changing, but in terms of metal and that hard rock stuff, the sound was changing, and that's a very overproduced album.
Well, not just that, it's got a lot of keyboards.
Oh yeah, the keyboard, and it wasn't. I don't think it was Don Airey on that album.
It was
Don Airey, but it just was so much on Bark at the Moon. It was so prominent because he had keyboards. Obviously, Mr. Crowley from the first album is keyboard heavy song.
But that was a unique song on that album,
right? So they had keyboards, but it was so much more prominent in Bark at the Moon, and then later on it gets even more prominent.
Well, Jakey Lee's guitar work was also heavier than Randy Rhoads. Randy Rhoads almost had kind of a whimsical style, whereas Jakey Lee was a little heavier. So they had a very different sound. Mm-hmm. They had a different relationship, and that's very apparent from his two albums. You've got Randy Rhoads on the first two albums, Jakey Lee on the second two albums. That was
The Ultimate Sin.
Ultimate Sin.
And that's a good album. But if you see on that album, Jake got his writing credits back.
He did, and
reluctantly too. Sharon was very reluctant about that whole thing.
That was the most successful album for Ozzy. It sold the most. It was huge, but Ozzy doesn't like the album.
Oh,
it's his least favorite.
It's too slick of a production. Mm-hmm. The songs are too, for lack of a better term, too soft. And there's nothing really heavy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think Lightning Strikes is a really good song. Could have been heavier.
Shot in the Dark is a big one.
Shot in the Dark was a huge hit, but it was such a wimpy kind of sound. I mean, it may not have been the song itself, but the production, it's just a soft production.
That was Ozzy's. He hates the production on that album.
It could probably be such a heavier song if it wasn't for that lame production.
So
I think that was Roy Thomas Baker who produced it, and that has a lot to do with it too. Because he's very known for that, so
almost muted kind of
and very keyboard heavy and very slick.
So basically, the takeaway that I took was that after Randy's death, the environment for anybody coming into the band, they almost became like a hired gun. They weren't. It was no longer the band that started off as Blizzard of Oz. It was Ozzy and whoever he was playing with. And it wasn't necessarily from Ozzy's perspective, but it was from his camp because his manager was kind of seeing to it that there was always kind of a relationship of whoever comes in, you're replaceable. It kind of changed with Zakk Wylde.
That changed a lot with Zakk Wylde.
But that was because Zakk got along so well with Ozzy, and Zakk was a huge Randy Rhoads fan. And they had that relationship through him, even though Zakk didn't really know Randy Rhoads. But they had that relationship through him that kind of healed Ozzy in a way.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Zakk is still there to this day.
And he left and came back.
Well, yeah, he's gone back and forth. But, I mean, he's always said that Father Ozzy is always going to be, the one he looks up to. I mean, you think about Ozzy brought him in. He was 19 years old.
So he was relatively like Randy.
Exactly. I mean, unknown.
There's a lot of commonalities there.
There's a tremendous amount of. I mean, besides the skills, because the skills are not compare. It's
they're completely different players.
The 19 years old, basically coming from New Jersey all the way over to California, and just essentially giving himself to Ozzy for a long time.
He was a super positive guy.
Oh yeah.
Just fun to be around. So to conclude, back to Jakey Lee, he came in at a tough time, but he was a more than competent guitarist. he never had the opportunity that Randy Rhoads had, but he definitely filled in and in probably the toughest time for Ozzy, and still put out some amazing albums.
Definitely. So Ozzy released The Ultimate Sin early 1986, and when he decided to go on tour, he brings this band that they got a name for themselves in the thrash scene, the underground metal scene, Metallica, and now all of a sudden they are going to they basically shoot up the top. Master of Puppets gets released a couple months later, and so I guess they go on tour together at that point. Metallica's opening up for Ozzy, and by comparison sakes, a lot of people were saying that Metallica was blowing Ozzy off the stage. Ozzy's doing the Ultimate Sin tour, Metallica's doing Master of Puppets. You tell me which one is a little bit more powerful at that point.
Oh yeah.
So to his credit, Ozzy did not or was not afraid of Metallica. Let me put these young kids out there. They're going to blow me off the stage, but you know what? I'm still Ozzy Osbourne, and you're here to see me.
Which is the positive attitude you definitely want. You don't want somebody that's bothered by somebody up and coming and going to hold them down.
Or give them half a stage. I mean, he gave Ozzy, he did a lot for Motley Crue. And then he gives Metallica not a big stage, but enough where they were able to put crosses on stage and able to do a lot of things that they eventually, led them to being a bigger band.
Well, that being said, Ozzy's been given a lot of bands a huge forum through Ozfest.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he really has.
But then he get paid for it, too.
Well, that doesn't hurt.
Yeah. You want Ozfest, you're going to have to pay for it. Well, the story of Metallica, obviously everyone, I don't want to say everyone knows this. There are a lot of people that are new to metal that don't necessarily know the story of Metallica. I'm not going to get into every little detail of how Metallica started and where we got up to, but in 1982, they recruit Cliff Burton to play bass for them. They move to San Francisco. They record an underground tape or a demo tape, that underground hit called "No Life to Leather." It's picked up by a guy in New Jersey named Johnny Z, and Johnny Z says, "I have to sign these guys." He pays for them to come across the country. He records their first album. They're living in his front porch inside the house. They have no money, no nothing. They record Kill 'Em All. So we know that story. Kill 'Em All goes on. They do the Raven and Metallica Kill 'Em All for one tour. They're touring across the country. Their second album is, they go to record Ride the Lightning in Copenhagen. They record it. It comes out again on Megaforce Records. Then they get signed by Elektra Records. Elektra re-releases Ride the Lightning. Basically, they're off and running with the major label, major management, because they changed management from Johnny Z to Q Prime. Now they're off and running. Cliff Burton, to me, was how would you say it? He basically was the maestro of that band, in my opinion.
For those two albums.
For the three albums.
Well, from what I understand and what Lars has expressed is that it wasn't until Ride the Lightning that Cliff and Kirk really began their influence on the band, because a lot of the stuff that was on Kill 'Em All was Kirk and James. It was Lars and James.
Right.
Because they had been writing that stuff.
Those songs were written before.
So there was a minimal aspect of Cliff and Kirk's presence on the first album.
Yeah, Kirk really all he did was play guitar solos.
Yeah, he just played what Mustaine had played before him. And then Cliff, really his only major contribution to that first album was Anesthesia.
Writing-wise.
Writing-wise.
Yeah, he
brought in a playing style that far surpassed his predecessor, Ron McGovney.
Exactly.
But he didn't have the writing credit.
No, right.
And his presence in the following two albums, in Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, was so much more there.
Yeah. For sure. Ride the Lightning, obviously, with Cthulhu and, For Whom the Bell Tolls, his Cliff's writing was on full, on full force. But it wouldn't be until Master of Puppets, when he did his little masterpiece of Orion, that people really kind of had the full effect of what Cliff was all about.
Yes.
So they're on tour with Ozzy. In '86 with the Ultimate Sin tour for Ozzy, and they're promoting Master of Puppets. They go to Europe to headline small venues. I believe Anthrax was their opening act in most of the shows.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's weird. So
that's how big Metallica got so fast.
Oh yeah, it was. But they weren't playing big places in Europe the way they do now. But still, they were headlining clubs. You know, and Metallica, like I said before in the first episode, Metallica is near and dear to my heart. Everything that, just about everything they do, I'm going to like.
Especially Lulu.
Yeah, not that one. There's nothing like those first 4 albums, if you want to put it that way. Metallica is very special to me. That being said, Master of Puppets is Cliff's
magnum opus.
Yeah, it has something like that. I mean, everyone thinks it might be Anesthesia. It's not. Even though
that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, no, that was just him. Basically, it was a bass version of all these guitar players jerking off on stage. Showing how fast they can play. His was more not about speed, but it was about dexterity and this crazy distorted sound. And even then, Orion, which was supposed to be, I guess another extension of that. I mean, the song itself was great. His bass solo was kind of dumped in the mix, and that was the beginning of the bad bass playing mixes for all the bass players in Metallica. So they're on tour in Europe, and they have a bus accident. We'll just put it like that. For the people who don't know, I don't want to rehash everything over and over again. But I do know there's a faction of people out there that don't know the stories and don't know the tales and everything that happened, weren't there, they weren't alive. But that doesn't mean that that fan base is less significant. It's just a matter of trying to move the story along while not dragging it out for 3 hours, because we can talk about Metallica or Ozzy or AC/DC all day long. So they're in Europe during the Damage Incorporated tour. And supporting Master of Puppets when they have a bus accident on the evening of September 26th or in the morning of September 27th. The bus flips over. Cliff is ejected from his bunk. The bus lands on him. He is killed. And Metallica, at this point, is just devastated. But I think those guys' will to play and continue was, as much as they were devastated, it was so much, Lars was not going to be stopped. I think if the band had said, I'm going to stop right now, I think James would have been okay with it, personally. Maybe not Kirk. Kirk probably would have went back to Exodus or something like that. But
he would have found a home
Yeah,
somewhere.
he would have found a home. But I think Lars is what pushed James to continue. And, they did not grieve. They did not mourn. They had shows to make up. So 7 weeks later, there's a bass player named Jason Newsted who's in the band now, and they go to play Japan. Completely different player from Cliff. Plays with a pick. He's more metal than any guy in the band. And when I say that, they're playing thrash and they're playing fast speed, but Cliff was not just a metal guy. Cliff was a punk guy. Cliff was a country guy. Cliff was a southern rock guy. And Cliff was a classical guy.
He was an amalgamation of so many things. I mean, he even talked about, if you've ever seen the documentary, I say documentary, but it was more of a compilation of videos, Cliff 'Em All. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about all these things, like different bands that they love. He's just talking to Kirk, and that's Merciful Fate, that's this and that, and he's just so excited about it. And then he's putting all these ideas that are influenced. They don't sound just like who they were, but they were just influenced by these bands into his own art.
Right.
And he was just a great songwriter.
Oh, he was, and a great player.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those fingers were flying. Jason, on the other hand, was a metalhead. He was a Metallica fan, and he was all about the metal. And, during the Black Album tour, they joke about, him being metal. and too metal sometimes, but that's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's what kept the fans in there. Yeah. I mean, Jason's playing and Jason's showmanship during, the Black Album tour, during the Load tour, even during the Justice tour was basically what reined in all the fans. And
yeah, people that were kind of put off by the change in sound. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so Jason kept that. I mean, he was the thread that kept everything together for a while. Cliff's influence on Metallica can be seen going into, or not can be seen. Cliff's influence on Metallica can be noticed on how everything changed on And Justice for All. As much as it's a very similar album and it's considered one of the top, the 4 classics, if you sit there and one, listen to the sound, 2, the progressiveness of the songs, okay?
Yeah, you can definitely hear the sound change in the bass line.
Well, what bass?
Or lack thereof.
But even with that being, done, just the whole production of it, and then not because the bass is missing, but the guitar is now way up front. Okay? There's nobody that's playing a bass guitar in Metallica, that's sitting there saying, hey, I need to be up front or I need to be higher in the mix. Okay? Because Jason has no place now at this point. He's just still kind of like
the James and right, Lars show.
It becomes a James and Lars show, where before it was the Cliff, James and Lars show, because Kirk was still just a guitar player playing lead guitar solos.
That being said, I think Cliff was the balancing member of the band and was more inclusive because Kirk had his place there,
right?
And it was a band, and much like what I was talking about with Ozzy, when Randy died, it became less of a band and it was more of a
more of an Ozzy solo show.
And so the original 2 guys reverted back to what they were before.
Right.
They were in charge.
You can see the jump in songwriting and then in production. And then when they went to the Black Album, a lot of people sit there and say, "Oh, Cliff never would have done that," and I disagree personally. I think that they definitely could have or would have went in that direction based on Lars having a conversation saying, "Hey, I want to play more groove oriented," and that probably would have fell right into Cliff's pocket because he can get that groove. I mean, listen to For Whom the Bell Tolls.
It wouldn't have been the same.
No, it wouldn't have been the same. It would have been a completely different album.
Yeah,
but it wouldn't have been the Black Album.
But they might have still diverged in some capacity.
Right. It wouldn't have been. I don't think it would have been as progressive as And Justice for All. For what it was. I mean, even though they did similar things with Master of Puppets, being that you have the main riff and then you have the middle section and you have the solo and then however it was pieced together. You listen to again Justice for All or even what's the song like Shorter Straw? Those little chunks of songs that are basically one riff here, one riff there, and especially when Justice for All's got like 5 different riffs in there.
Yeah,
that as much as that's their style now, and that's what the way they've always claimed to do their songs. That's not really true when you think about it. There's 1 or 2 riffs here in every song. That's natural, but to have 5 or 6 in one song, that Cliff wouldn't have done that. He would.
You're actually losing material by using too many riffs in one song.
Right. I mean, so them changing to the more groove, I think would have been definitely okay with Cliff on the Black Album. The songs would have been different, but it would have been a really cool groove. That being said, we will never know.
Yeah.
We have the last tribute to Cliff on And Justice for All with To Live Is to Die.
Wasn't there more than just that as far as his writing credits?
No, that was it.
That was the only one? Okay.
Yeah. No, and the words that are said in that song were his words.
Yeah.
So. And
that song has a little bit different feel than the rest of the album too, and not just because it's a slower song. There's just something about
one main riff, dun, 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 and it just goes on, and similar to how Orion has that one thing until it goes into the little the high end bass solo. That's where you see the big difference when the band changed. He's like, all right, James. It became, like you say, the James and Lars show, or actually more Lars and James show, because Lars is the driving force behind that band. Yeah,
Lars was definitely the catalyst that pushed everything forward. I mean, it kind of in the same way that Sharon, said we need to keep going.
Right.
Same thing.
Exactly.
Not the same person. But.
Right. There's always one main person who's going to be the driving force, and everyone comes along. And I don't think James is a tag along in that regards, because obviously he's the one who's writing the riffs and the lyrics.
Not at all.
But he's, if there's anyone that's going to sit there and say, hey, come on and grab a hand, it's going to be Lars first. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's always someone that way. And Lars, for lack of, for better or worse, Lars is what he is. So that was Cliff Burton of Metallica, and we can see a distinct difference from before his death and after his death. We've spoken about Ozzy and Randy Rhoads before his death and after his death. Who do we got next?
So one of the biggest guys and most difficult changes in a band was probably Bon Scott, AC/DC. And not necessarily difficult as in a huge change in the style of the band, but basically what he represented. So let's start from the beginning. While the band formed in 1973, Bon Scott is kind of recognized as the original singer of AC/DC to most people because that's really the first that anybody heard of the band.
Right. When the band broke in Australia, he was their singer.
Yeah, and they had recorded one single with Dave Evans, the original singer, but that never made it over to the United States.
Who is still living off that one single. I mean, and I don't think it's a financial thing. I think he's just the fact that he was associated with AC/DC, he's still living off that. I can't stand that crap.
Well, we'll talk about that.
That's a whole nother episode.
There's a lot of guys like that in the industry. So the first album that was released was High Voltage, and it's not the High Voltage that most people know. It's the Australian release High Voltage. So what's interesting about that is much of the first album was released on the 74 Jailbreak, which came out after Bon's death in 1984.
Right.
2 songs made it onto the international release of High Voltage, and the other 2 songs from the album, there's a total of 8, were released in 2009 on Backtracks. So it took a long time for everything from that original album, the Bon Scott era, to get to the United States. The second album was TNT, which the majority of was actually on our version of High Voltage. So there's a lot of kind of oddities in the release schedule of AC/DC's original material.
Well, that's because that's how long it took for them to row the boat to get the records over here from Australia. Go on. I'm sorry.
So AC/DC didn't really hit the U.S. until 1976. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's nothing to me describes AC/DC in the Bon Scott era more than there's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.
Yeah.
And that's the truth. I mean, they had to fight and scrimp and save and sleep in the back of cars and whatever had to happen for them to be a rock band. And that song just speaks so truly. So the next release that we got was Let There Be Rock. We missed out on Dirty Deeds Don't Turn Cheap.
That makes no sense to me. But again, that's a record company sitting there saying they would rather not have this album for whatever reason.
They didn't think it would be successful or whatever their decision was. They just didn't want to release it. Now, keep in mind that records were released more rapidly during that time. We touched on this before, where the press aspect of bands was not there.
Right.
So the creativity was able to continue. There wasn't a press circuit where you had to go around and do a bunch of interviews, sign autographs, etc. These guys just kept going. So they got Let There Be Rock, and it was pretty commercially successful. I mean, it wasn't huge, but then we had Powerage. We had the live album, If You Want Blood, You Got It, which was fairly successful. It had all the major hits. It was basically an AC/DC greatest hits album up to that point.
I was still wondering how Angus was able to survive that guitar through the belly. I couldn't understand that. As a kid,
the pre-Photoshop era too.
And that's the amazing part about it. It's pre-Photoshop. But what was weird is that I always said to myself, okay, so he's got this guitar sticking in him on the front cover, right? And on the back cover, he's laying flat down on the ground with the guitar sticking straight up. It's like, what about the body of the guitar? Where's the body? I mean, so this album came out when I was 9 years old. I didn't know anything about it, but I would see it in the stores, and I'm like, how does this happen? How is this guy alive? And then
the
on
things
the back,
that kids think about.
Yeah, I mean, he's dead on the back cover, but yet the guitar is not like it's sticking straight up, but it's not. How does that work? And I even think in today's Photoshop age, they still would have done the same thing.
Probably.
But it's so, as a 9-year-old, you're like, how does this work?
So now we're up to Highway to Hell, which is AC/DC's breakthrough album. They're finally gaining traction. They're getting on TV shows. They're getting the airtime. Unfortunately, just 7 months later, Bon Scott passes away in the back of a car from acute alcohol poisoning. It's kind of been disputed whether it was other drugs involved, etc. But that's the official reason, and that's what it maintains today. So in the liner notes of Highway to Hell on the re-released digipack from a few years back, it also says that he froze to death. So there's a lot there that's kind of a mystery, but we probably will never know, at least until the passing of Angus, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, and that's
God forbid.
When you sit there and say froze to death, it's hard to understand. It really was hypothermia. I mean, he was cold, his body, not moving because he's passed out drunk in the middle of really cold weather. So that's freezing to death, basically.
So you have a band that's just had their major breakthrough, and a close-knit group. Bon and Angus had a really strong friendship. He was the older guy they looked up to. Right.
He was like a father figure.
And so it was
one partying father figure.
Oh yeah. There was a quote from Angus where he talked about, you had this guy that drank like a fish, and then he'd wake up in the morning no worse for wear, and everybody was like, how does this guy keep going? So it was a huge surprise when, a guy like that just suddenly passes away. What Bon brought to the band was not just being a singer, but he was actually a drummer before.
Okay.
It's not very well known, but that was kind of the mentality he came in with. So he had kind of more of a band member mentality that was said by most people, rather than being a front man. So he was a team player start. He also was the lyricist. I mean, he was a poet.
Yeah, we can tell.
Which, there's a little bit of a conspiracy involving his notebook after he passed away. But what really made him interesting was that he had a clever lyricism that it just really can't be matched.
No, I mean, the words that he said, it's very, obviously with songs like Big Balls, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap.
They were a little on the nose, but those are the minority.
Yeah, but Touch Too Much, even Highway to Hell. I mean, the songs obviously have a particular style and rhythm to the lyric writing.
Well, he had a way with double entendre.
Exactly. That was his big thing, the double entendre. Mm-hmm. And that's what would end up becoming missing from the band after he passes away.
And much like the other two bands that we've mentioned, I mean, the initial shock pretty much just they said, we don't want to keep going. It was just painful. These guys were musicians, and musicians to the core, and they found more solace in continuing to play music, and not necessarily for any reason other than they just went back to work,
right,
just playing. And it wasn't even to record a new album or anything like that. That was what they knew what to do. They kind of decided that they were going to start, doing something, working on a project. And there was one person they wanted to specifically hear, and that was Brian Johnson. And the reason for that was Bon was actually a huge fan of Brian Johnson. He had seen him play in England, and they wanted to bring him on board just for a tryout because he had spoken so highly of him. So they bring him over, he had actually already been singing a whole lot of Rosie with his band Geordie. So he had something. I mean, he basically came in, played that song. They fell in love with the guy. I mean, he was as heartbroken over Bond's death as they were, because he knew the man, and it was just a tough thing to see somebody that was so kind, so likable, lost. And what also made Brian just fit right in was that he had the seal of approval from Bond's parents. I mean, they went to see him. They said, "That's the guy. Continue with him. Don't quit." So it all the pieces just fell together just really quickly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Bond passed away in February, and the album is out July. So, picking a new singer, recording a brand new album, and it being as big as it was,
the biggest
in that short period of time,
as big as Highway to Hell was
at the time.
Yeah. No, as big as Highway to Hell was.
Oh, as big as comma.
Back in Black
right.
was bigger.
Oh, obviously.
I mean,
it's still felt today.
A better produced album. The sound alone is just so clean, and not in an overproduced way or cheesy way.
Well, both albums, Highway to Hell, and Back in Black, were both produced by Robert John Mutt-Lange.
And he learned from the first work with AC/DC,
right,
and took it to the next level. And so it was just such an interesting thing for them to go so quickly into creating this new album, and produce some amazing songs that are still. I mean, Iron Man used most of that material from Back in Black on the movies.
Well, it's the only greatest hits compilation that AC/DC has ever released.
Was the Iron Man 2 soundtrack.
Iron Man 2 soundtrack.
So here leads into the conspiracy theory regarding Back in Black, which would be that AC/DC basically had somebody go in and take Bond's songbook before all of his belongings were sent to his parents. So the theory is, because there's so much similarity in the lyrics of some of the songs on Back in Black, that there's a possibility that some of that material was taken from his songbook. Now, there's no way we'll ever know this.
Let's talk about this a little bit and break this down, because we have the opportunity. You Shook Me All Night Long. Everything in that song is Bond. I'm sorry, Brian Johnson did not come up with that crap.
Well, Brian Johnson, keep in mind, he didn't write a lot of lyrics on most of his time in AC/DC.
Well, he stopped writing lyrics after Fly on the Wall. Mm-hmm. So he hasn't written a lyric since Fly on the Wall.
But none of those albums past Back in Black have that same lyrical value.
Right, so that's where
they're all pretty one-dimensional.
The conspiracy theory falls into place. I can say, okay, Back in Black is not a Bond song.
Back in Black, the song itself, not at all.
I can totally get that. But You Shook Me All Night Long, and apparently what I've read recently was Have a Drink on Me, despite being kind of obnoxious considering that he died of alcoholism, was a song that they were writing with Bond. Mm-hmm. You have that song. You have I'm Giving the Dog a Bone. That is classic Bon Scott.
Oh, absolutely.
What Do You Do for Money, Honey is classic Bon Scott. And
I can hear him singing in my head. I can hear them singing
exactly. So to me, that whole conspiracy theory thing is totally plausible, because if you listen to the lyrics to, especially, I mean, no more than You Shook Me All Night Long, that song is so double entendre that and Given the Love and Bone, those two songs, so much of Bond's lyrical style. And to think that it's never been repeated since, and since it was Angus and Malcolm writing all the words since Fly on the Wall on, and they don't have anything close to that, and basically all Malcolm and Angus can come up with is something with rock and roll in it. Because every damn song that they do is...
Well, they did Thunderstruck and songs like that, and they're great songs, don't get me wrong.
No, obviously they're
fantastic songs, but the lyrical content is different. So that's the biggest thing that changed was what Bond brought to the band the cleverness of the lyrics was different. You know, it was more one-dimensional. It was more straightforward. The double entendre was gone. It just, that's where they go. But that being said, AC/DC is one of those bands that basically can put out the same album over and over and over again and somehow make it work. And it's great. You know,
one of the few bands that do it.
There's not very many that do, and it works, but they're one of them. There's never going to be another Bon Scott, but there's also never going to be another Brian Johnson. I mean, the guy is his air raid siren.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of guys that have that similar sound. You know, the gravelly voice. I mean, Udo, Mark Tonello.
But the power that was behind that guy's voice.
The power. I mean, I love the song that Brian did with Jackal. That's an awesome song, Locked and Loaded. But yeah, his voice, two distinct different voices. I love Bon's voice. Somehow my wife can't figure out either one. She thinks they're the same. You
know, I've heard people say that. I remember I was in high school.
I never get it.
Yeah, I was in high school, and my friend Eddie was, you know, they found this guy that sounded exactly the same, and like, no.
Not at all. Not at all. I always said you can understand what Bon said. I can't. I still to this day half the time don't know what Brian is saying, and that's with reading the lyrics. It's a tough thing to lose a singer in a band. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's, you know, obviously we've talked about a guitar player, we've talked about a bass player, we've talked about a singer, and those are hard. I mean, singers are hard to replace. Oddly enough, bands have done it. And
so, what about a drummer?
Funny you should mention that. And you started off the show by saying that the criteria for this was how a death of a musician changed the way the bands sounded, the way the bands recorded, the way the bands wrote music.
What about the way that music changed?
Well, I'm going to talk about John Bonham briefly from Led Zeppelin, and because I can, and because I want to. Well,
I can't disagree with you talking about him, but even though I don't feel it necessarily fits the criteria, but what he changed when he died was not, and I will let you speak about his effect on Led Zeppelin, but just music in general. Mm-hmm. When he died, music changed.
Oh, yeah. Lots of things changed that year. John Bonham from the band Led Zeppelin, at the time of his death, was one of the most influential drummers in rock. And I say that because that dude played drums like no, I mean, he pounded the drums. He was punishing to drums, but yet had a dexterity and a smoothness about him that is hardly ever replicated in that style. You say the music changed, okay? 1980 was obviously, Bon Scott died in 1980. John Bonham died in 1980. So what I was trying to say about John and Led Zeppelin and what changed for them, they were so distraught about his death, unlike AC/DC, unlike Metallica, unlike Ozzy, they literally came out and said, we're done. They said, because of his death, we're not going to continue. And this is the quote. Led Zeppelin released on December 4th, 1980. We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep respect we have for his family, together with the sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager, have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were. Signed, Led Zeppelin. When you talk about an effect on music, the fact that a drummer, and not to take away from drummers, but the fact that a drummer passing away basically made three other virtuoso musicians say, we can't continue as Led Zeppelin, is a monumental statement all in itself.
It's huge.
And that's why I chose to talk about Bonham, because his influence, you put it this way, his influence as a drummer up until 1980 was felt for obviously up until now, because people still talk about John Bonham.
Oh, yeah. I think his legend grew after he died.
Oh, yeah.
Too, for sure.
And so now we have, talking about drummers going full circle in this whole episode, we started talking about three drummers that passed away. Neil Peart being the most influential of them all. And, you know, John Bonham influenced heavy metal drumming. I mean, he was going to play double bass drums on Communication Breakdown. And Jimmy said, no, it's too busy. To think that nowadays, that's what it is. I mean, there's so much drumming in songs nowadays. Like, come on, dude, you don't have to play, quintupled notes in 3 seconds.
Tell that to Dream Theater.
Exactly. I mean, Mike Portnoy, it's his fault. No, I mean, when you think about it, all these bands, I mean, the black metal bands, the death metal bands out in Europe, Portnoy, the progressive bands, it all goes back to, in hard rock drumming, all goes back to John Bonham pounding away at the skins. In 1969, playing triplets during Communication Breakdown, or I'm sorry, Good Times, Bad Times, with a single bass drum, not double, and you could hear it. I mean, imagine if he would have played with the double.
Oh yeah.
So that's where his influence in what changed. Music changed, and you said earlier that the music changed. What to you changed about the music or about music?
His passing. I mean, people were influenced by him before he passed away, but after he passed away, I mean, he became legend. So many people, interview after interview, people cite him as an influence, but a lot of times people will say this guy's an influence and you can't tell. But his effect can be felt across music.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it just, not just in metal, but hard rock, in any genre. All these guys we talked about, Neil Peart, Sean Reinert, Reed Mullen, all of them, I'm sure, had some interest, like going back. I mean, I remember listening to Gene Hoglan talk about the influence that John had. I mean, today, the only person that could replace him for any amount of shows was his own son.
And I don't think that's necessarily because he's just as good as his father.
It's because of the emotional connection.
Right, it's the emotional connection. And he's a damn good drummer himself.
He is.
But it took a long time for him to come to realize that he needed to stop drinking himself to death and doing the drugs that he did.
And following his father's footsteps.
Rather than follow into the grave, he decided to follow into the drum set. And, he was bred for this as a kid, playing with Zeppelin as a kid in rehearsals, but he fully realized his potential when he became the drummer for Led Zeppelin later on.
Yeah, you hit it right on the nose. It was that emotional connection that allowed for that any amount of shows for Led Zeppelin to ever occur. And that's the thing. Anytime we lose one of these guys, it's heartbreaking, and we wish we would have known what would have happened next. What ends up happening is their legend grows and grows, and today, luckily, we still have all these recordings from these guys. We can hear Randy Rhoads. We can hear.
I wish I could hear more Randy.
Oh man!
I mean, I bought the Quiet Riot years, a compilation by Rhino, and you can hear some of the Ozzy stuff in there that he pulled out of those songs.
Yeah,
but I mean, it's not the same. And you can hear it's so raw.
He's so young, too. And Quiet Riot, and I mean, we can go into this in another episode, but Quiet Riot during that time, there was a lot of upheaval with other members of the band, and that's why they didn't continue in the way they did with that lineup, because there was so much going on. So it wasn't exactly the most conductive and productive environment either.
Right. When you mentioned earlier the influence of all these musicians that have passed away, and when you think about the list that we put together, and I'm just looking at mine, you look at Phil, Lynott on bass for Thin Lizzy. He was a vocalist and a bass player, and not only that, a black Irishman. I mean, so he had all these different things about him that made him so special and unique. And Thin Lizzy basically ended after he passed away until they reunited later on and decided to honor his legacy. Hillel Slovak from Red Hot Chili Peppers passing away, I mean, devastated them. But they came back, they brought in John Frusciante, and they came back with the best album that they could possibly make with Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I mean, an incredible album. Def Leppard goes huge with Hysteria, and then in between albums, Steve Clark passes away. So even though Def Leppard, the sound continued and the style continued, they're probably one of the few bands that you could say that the change in guitar players was almost minimal to the songwriting and the sound. because the sound is the sound. That Def Leppard sound is not changing, no matter who's playing.
Yeah.
But for the band members themselves, it was a huge loss. And Vivian Campbell, stepped in and has done a fabulous job ever since. Then you have other bands like Nirvana or Blind Melon or Pantera or Damage Plan.
Even modern bands like Motorhead.
Oh yeah, modern bands like Motorhead.
Well, modern passings.
Oh,
I guess you're saying all these bands that the members passed away in the 90s.
Yeah, years ago.
But you got Lemmy who just passed away, or Dio.
It's amazing. Dio's been gone for 10 years.
Yeah,
that's incredible. Dio passing. I mean, Lemmy passing a few years was. I mean, if you talk about one particular person passing away, where their influence is felt across the board, Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead dying was a set. Everybody in rock, everybody in metal. It didn't matter what genre of rock it was.
Yeah.
Lemmy dying affected everybody because Lemmy was everybody's friend. That's the amazing part. There was barely anybody who had a bad word to say about Lemmy.
Yeah.
He was everyone's friend. I mean, and then on top of that, the guy just let you be. He'd say hi, and he had some interest in you as a person, but it wasn't. He wasn't this scary guy that a lot of people thought he was.
Probably the definition of chill.
Oh, jeez. I mean, so someone like him passing away deeply affected a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people.
And each one that you listed in the last batch was guys that when they died, it ended the band. I mean, because they either were the band, or they were so synonymous with that name that there was no way to replace them.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously Motorhead. He was Motorhead.
I mean, Shannon Hoon is a little different. They continued.
Blind Melon ended, and for a few years, and then they came back. And they reunited.
But most of them, that was the end.
I mean, you think about someone like Kurt Cobain from Nirvana. I mean, that ended the band, and
there's no way you could continue.
You can't replace a guy like that.
No.
I mean, he was the main songwriter. His death didn't affect me the same way as it
affected so many
because I was a generation ahead of that. So, but I mean, I was still part of that scene. Listening to the grunge scene and all that stuff. Kurt Cobain's passing to me was almost like stupid, and I hate to say it that way, but it's like obviously the heroin had an effect on him that was beyond compare. I mean, he was depressed, and people will sit there and say, well, what's he depressed about? He's making all these millions of dollars, and he's got all the money in the world, and he's got all the fans in the world. But what people don't understand about depression is it affects, it doesn't matter who you are, what you do, where you live. Depression will overwhelm you to a point where someone like that with all the success in the world is going to dive deep into heroin and kill himself. And that's sad. And depression is worse than the drugs.
I mean, there's more to it than that. I mean, not everybody is happy with that amount of fame.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And the depression's only going to get worse when you're not happy. Mm-hmm. And it's a conundrum because you're doing the thing that you love, but sometimes for the wrong reasons. And it's very important when you feel that way to get help. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when you're in the situation that a guy like him that he's in, you have so many people around you telling you what you have to do, and there's not always an easy way out.
Right. And another one affected in similar ways with depression and drugs was Chris Cornell.
That was so shocking.
From his best friend, Andrew Wood, in Mother Love Bone passing away, that affected him deeply. So much so, at the time, he made Temple of the Dog to honor his friend. Then to come back so many years later in 2017, we're oddly enough, I mean, we don't know these people's personal lives, but he was obviously on some sort of drugs, and I think it were antidepressants or whatever they were, and then getting to a point where you commit suicide because of something stupid, like his wife was saying that he, it was the drugs that made him commit suicide, not the drugs, not like heroin or cocaine or anything like that, but the kind of the prescription drugs, and that's just terrible to then affect another best friend of his, Chester Bennington, the same year. He couldn't go on or he felt he couldn't go on because, again, another person that was depressed because they just couldn't handle certain things. I mean,
it shows that you never know what's going on deep inside someone. So it's important to listen to those around you. And when they are expressing that they're dealing with depression, be there. Mm-hmm. Or at least help them find some way out.
Yes. So, a somber subject, but unfortunately, it's something that has to be tackled. I think we talked about Ozzy Osbourne, Randy Rhoads, AC/DC and Bon Scott, Metallica, Cliff Burton, John Bonham and Led Zeppelin. We talked about several different bands. So now we're going to swing around and talk about our big four for the week. Our big four this week is based on instrumentals. The top four, or our big four instrumentals, but they're fully realized songs. So they can't be a guitar solo.
No eruption.
No eruptions. No chupacabras from Black Label Society.
No intros to songs.
No intros like Hellinger from Judas Priest.
And if it was, it needs to be a full song regardless.
But even still, you can tell it's an intro. It's going to lead into something else. Mm-hmm. We don't want that. We're a completely separate song.
Yes.
So, you want me to start or you want to start?
Go ahead. Start with your number 4. My
number 4. Well, I don't think I have these in any particular order. So
that's fine.
But looking at the songs I have, I actually have 5. But I'm gonna.
You got to limit it.
So I have an honorable mention.
No ties.
No, there's no ties. I have an honorable mention. My honorable mention is going to be "Stream of Consciousness" by Dream Theater, and I heard it for the first time this morning, doing my homework on this, and I think the notes I wrote, it's an epic like song, okay, and it reminds me a lot of Metallica. Or it could remind anybody, of Metallica when you listen to it. Not that it, the riffs or anything, but it's just a structure very similar to Orion, very similar to Cthulhu. And because of that, it became my honorable mention. But let's go to my top 4. Now, my number 4 song is going to be, and I haven't even listened to this in a while, but I just know the song, Black Star from Yngwie Malmsteen.
I'm very shocked that you picked that one.
Why?
Just because of your history with Yngwie.
Well, because he tried to return CDs to me. But you know what? Yngwie Malmsteen, and it's almost weird. The band himself almost kind of kills the criteria because another one of the criteria was it couldn't be an instrumental band.
Well, it was Rising Force, and
it was
on
a
that
band.
album he has a singer. Right. On every album he has a singer.
Right, so he has vocals.
You're still within the rules.
That's how we got around that.
Yes.
But Black Star, the first song on Yngwie's solo album, his premiere album, Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force, is still such an influential song today to so many guitar players, especially beautiful out in Europe. And it's a gorgeous song. The guitar solos, the whole thing. Obviously influenced by Ritchie Blackmore, influenced by classical music. Black Star is an amazingly beautiful song. So that was my number 4. You want to do your number 4?
Yeah. I'm also going to start off with an honorable mention, and it's not necessarily what I would say is my number 5, but it's one that I think that you should listen to, and that would be Stradivarius Stratofortress.
Okay.
So Stradivarius is a Finnish band that is popular in the progressive rock genre. It's probably not well known to a lot of people, but what I love about Stratofortress is that it's so whimsical, to use a word I used earlier. Right. It's so cool because it's such a fast song, and you're listening to the keyboards and the guitar just lightning blazing fast. And it's just so fun to listen to.
I've heard the name before, Stradivarius, and I had never sat down to listen to him. So I will give it a listen to, because one thing about the homework that we did on this is open my mind and my ears to certain songs that I had never heard before, like Stream of Consciousness and some others that, obviously, I wanted to mention this earlier. I am someone who is mainstream in terms of metal, okay? I like all the classic metal bands, the newer metal bands, like from, and I say this, the newer, the ones from the 2000s who are already 20 years old when you think about it, okay? So...
these whippersnappers.
I know. So, the new metal movement, there are a lot of bands that I like from that. The new wave of American heavy metal, there are some bands I like out of that. Very few metalcore bands that I like, but I have nothing against them. I don't listen to them. You know, with my age, I still listen to the old classic metal bands, so that's fine.
It's understandable.
You know, Black Sabbath still exists in a lot of people's worlds. This exercise is showing me that obviously there's more stuff out there. I still have a lot to listen to, and it's funny. There's one song that I'll just mention later on. There's one song of a band that started in the '80s that I still haven't listened to, and it's the first time I heard the damn song today. You know,
that's funny. You know, and it's funny. I'm almost the opposite in that way. Is that I've always kind of listened more in what's in the fringe. I'm a death metal guy, but a Scandinavian death metal guy. I love, you know, I've said many times that I love death, Florida death metal, early Florida death metal.
Yeah, early, because later Florida death metal.
Yeah, the later scene completely changed. Yeah, but I've opened my ears to more mainstream music that I've never given much of a chance. Like I said, with going to see Queensryche, I had never really given them a chance because I had only heard a few songs like Silent Lucidity and stuff that just didn't really appeal to me when I was younger.
Right.
So, my number 4, I'm going to go with...
You said Stradivarius.
No, that was my honorable mention.
Oh, that was your honorable mention. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No, my number 4 is Dialogue with the Stars from In Flames.
Oh, okay.
In Flames, early era, much like Metallica, just heavy music that I really loved. I didn't like their music as much later on once they changed their style, but that those first 4 or 5 albums were really heavy. Dialogue with the Stars is just such a well-written instrumental, very melodic, and just you feel that cosmic aspect of it. So that's definitely my number 5. I'm sorry, my number 4.
Cool. All right, so my number 3 on the big 4 instrumentals is going to be a cover song, and it is going to be Overkill doing Frankenstein.
Oh, Edgar Winter Group.
The Edgar Winter Group. That version that they do got lots of props from the record company. They went up to Bobby the Blitz and said, "Hey, man, never heard you sound better." That's because he wasn't singing. And they love to joke about it.
That is a great story.
Yeah, Overkill, incredible version of Frankenstein.
I think they're a pretty underrated band in general.
We're gonna have a discussion about New York thrash, and they're or let's say East Coast thrash, because East Coast and West Coast, big difference. Overkill still around today, still making songs. They much like Slayer have never compromised one bit through the years, and they're still making good albums today. I mean, now Jason Bittner's their drummer, and they feel that they're more musically, they're better musicians because Jason's in the band, and this guy's a drummer. So Jason Bittner's real good. So that's my number 3, Frankenstein from Overkill on the Horoscope album.
That's an interesting one. So my number 3 is one that might surprise my partner here, and that would be Mr. Scary by Dawkins.
Ooh,
and
really?
So it's funny because I've had that song since I owned an iPod. But I'm not a Dawkins fan.
I've had that song since I've owned an iPod too.
Yeah. Well, I never bought the album because I'm not a Dawkins fan. I've never really cared for the band as a whole, but George Lynch is a fantastic guitarist. And so we were actually talking the other day before we went to see the Queensryche show in Houston. I had almost kind of completely forgotten about that band. I mean, that song, because it's never on the tip of my tongue. I have probably listened to it about 4,000 times in high school alone. It's one of those that I couldn't stop listening to, but it just wasn't enough to bridge me into listening to that band.
And it won't.
It's heavier than anything else they put out.
It's weird. That album, Back for the Attack, has really heavy aspects to it. Mm-hmm. Yet, obviously Don makes everything light.
Yeah, his vocals are just so light, and it just didn't appeal to me. But it also had a death metal guy.
Right, exactly. Who would in terms of Dawkins? that album, that song is so heavy. There are other songs that are pretty heavy on the album, and then you have songs like Dream Warriors on that album, where if it wasn't for his vocals, I think Dream Warriors would be a heavier song. But it's something.
It's nothing against him as a singer. I mean,
it's everything. Well, no, that's everything against him because he brings everything down to a level that's so soft. It ruins things for some people. For other people,
that's what I mean. Right. I mean, I understand the appeal if you enjoy Dawkins, but for me, it doesn't hit. Like the title "Back for the Attack" actually kind of makes me laugh because to me, there's not an attack in his vocals.
No, there's nothing.
So what do you got for number 2?
Number 2. Well, no, I have my number 3. Oh no, that's right, number 3. My number 2 is going to be YYZ from Rush.
That's respectable.
You know, and the reason being is Rush may not be a metal band, but they're still a hard rock band.
That counts.
So it counts. And again, the influence is felt across the board with Rush and YYZ. I mean, they've got plenty of instrumental songs, and their other one that's really big, and a lot of guys will talk about it, between YYZ and La Villa Strangiato, that was on, I believe it was on Hemispheres. Those 2 songs are huge, and I just, because I grew up in moving pictures, I chose YYZ.
YYZ's heavier, and it fits more into the vein of metal. La Villa Strangiato is a cool song. It's not as well known. If you were to poll 10 people, I would say more would know YYZ for sure.
So I have a little trivia on YYZ.
Okay.
2 things. I don't know if you know this or not. YYZ is the airport code for Toronto.
I was always wondering
where that came from.
Where the name came from.
And what they play in the song, the rhythm and the beat that they play, is YYZ in Morse code.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that's interesting.
However that goes, that is Morse code for YYZ.
Wow.
And so who thinks of that crap? Neil Peart. Okay. Mind blown. So I learned that listening to the Jericho podcast with Mike Portnoy, who was a good friend of Neil Peart's.
Okay,
so
wow.
That's pretty cool. All right, so that's my number 2.
For number 2, I've got Racer X with Technical Difficulties.
Ooh, Racer X.
Yeah.
Wow.
Another one I've had forever. My friend George introduced me to Racer X, and I freaking love the song. It was one that anytime I was playing a racing game, I would listen to that song and Paranoid.
Paranoid.
Yeah. So it's definitely got to be my number 2.
Cool. That's wasn't expecting that one. All right, so my number 1, and everyone who knows me is going to know I'm going to pick this song, is Orion from Metallica. It's just a classic. It's an epic.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, most people. That's what Matt's saying in Miami. Shocked. He can't go 5 minutes without talking about Metallica, and it's true. But and I, you know what? I own it. Orion from Metallica. It is basically Cliff's masterpiece. So talking about what we talked about earlier, Orion. I mean, I could have picked Cthulhu. Not as good. Not as epic. Well, the end is epic.
It's a slow build. Yeah. The end is very awesome, but
Orion,
it takes a long time to get there.
Yeah, I mean, played at his funeral. The guitar solo in the middle break there. It's beautiful piece of music. So that's my number 1.
All right. For number 1, I've got Big Shocker with Death with Voice of the Soul.
I heard that today. It's a really good song.
It's a really good song. It's beautiful. It's 2-part guitar song. You got the electric guitar and the acoustic guitar. You really have to give it a listen if you haven't. Even if you're not a big death metal fan, it's not really truly a death metal song.
No, it's not.
But it's a heavy song and it's a somber song at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's very emotional. And just being as big a fan as I am of that band, I got to put it at my number 1.
Now, I listened to it today for the first time, and it is a beautiful song. I actually heard it on the way back home this afternoon, and it is a beautiful song. I like the song a lot. And so I learned a lot from this whole exercise. I mean,
that's awesome. That's all we can ask for, right?
Exactly. And that was great because, the stream of consciousness from Dream Theater and other things that I wanted to talk about too, Voices of Soul. I also heard the other instrumental from Death, which is Cosmic Sea.
Sea.
And
So jazzy.
As great guitar work is in there, but what I felt about that song is just there was nothing memorable about it. That's the way I felt.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. To me, it's about the vibe of the song. If you close your eyes, I mean, you can feel like you're out in space.
I couldn't close my eyes at work today.
You can't do that while you're driving.
Yeah, that either. But
Don't.
The one I mentioned earlier from the band Riot, Racing with the Devil on the Spanish Highway. Heard it for the first time today, and these were my notes. Good bass and drum work, guitar work is average, nothing extraordinary about it. But the song itself, the structure of that song is really cool. I like it. I like it a lot. I heard Cynic textures. Listening to Cynic for the first time, I had no idea that they were that proggy, but I also didn't know that they were that jazzy. But I heard, going into the weekend and knowing that Sean Reinert died on Saturday, good to listen to it and to see, or to hear that musicianship. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, great bass playing, very jazzy song. I like the way it went from the jazzy part to the metal part back to the jazz. So it was really cool. I mean, I heard some really cool songs today going through this exercise. And obviously we had the same, the songs that we know about, Cthulhu, Mr. Scary, To Live Is to Die from Metallica, Suicide and Redemption. One song I thought I was going to stick in there was Moby Dick from Led Zeppelin. That was another insertion. We didn't even mention Iron Maiden this episode with Transylvania, Genghis Khan.
I love their songs, but to me, the vocal songs for Iron Maiden are just so much better.
Although Transylvania is a pretty damn good song.
Oh, it is, absolutely.
And one song I forgot about was Genghis Khan. I forgot that was an instrumental.
Oh, it was on my list.
Was it?
But
was Ides of March on your list?
No, because of its
intro feel
it's
to
an
it.
Intro.
But it was funny. They would intro it during the Number of the Beast tour. Mm-hmm. But they would intro it into Murders in the Rue March.
Yeah, they changed
which is pretty cool. Anthrax has a couple, Def Leppard. And another one I thought about talking about was Little Wing from Stevie Ray Vaughan. He does an instrumental version of that song.
Yeah.
But since he's blues rock, I was like, we'll push that.
Really
it didn't fit the vein, but that is a good song.
Still, it's worth listening to.
All right, well, that wraps it up this week. Tell them how they can listen to us.
You can listen to us by downloading the Podbean app or streaming us on podbean.com. We are also now on iTunes, so subscribe, listen, and rate us. Be sure to check us out on social media. Like us on Facebook under Debating Metal, or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Debating Metal. If you prefer, you can email us at debatingmetal@gmail.com. If you agreed with our comments or just want to rip us a new one, be sure to leave your comments so we can read them, and if we like them, we'll read them on the show.
Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening.